You were never meant to hear this. In 1855, a girl knelt for prayer in the dark silence of a Wisconsin convent. By sunrise, she was gone, her name erased, her belongings vanished, her existence denied. 22 would follow. No graves. No records. Only the cold echo of bells where voices once prayed. This is not a ghost story. This is real. And it was covered up for more than 160 years. Until now. What if I told you the most disturbing secrets aren't buried in crypts, but hidden behind altars, sealed in doctrine and enforced through silence? The story you're about to hear has never been taught in schools, never acknowledged by the church, and never aired in polite company. Because it does more than frighten, it shatters trust in everything holy. In the woods outside Milwaukee, what was once a mansion of lumber wealth became a sacred place. St. Mary's Convent rose like a fortress of God's mercy, or so they claimed. 23 nuns arrived. They sang. They served. They sacrificed. And then, they started disappearing. One by one. Without warning. Without answers. Without return. You see, this isn't about a haunted house. This is about systemic religious manipulation. About obedience turned into a weapon, and faith used to erase lives. It's about how institutions bend reality to protect themselves, even when blood stains the floor beneath the altar. Historians dismissed the gaps in records. The church called them errors. But they weren't errors. They were erased names, deliberately removed from ledgers, diaries, and public memory. But in 2023, during chapel renovations, a sealed wall cracked open, and with it, a silence collapsed. Inside, they found something chilling, handwritten letters from the missing women. Scraps of fabric soaked in wax and blood. And a journal, belonging to Mother Superior herself. Pages that describe rituals no one ever expected to see within Catholic walls. This isn't just a tale of vanished women. It's a case study in control, in blind obedience, and in what happens when spiritual power becomes absolute. You may think you know how far the church will go to preserve its image, but I promise you, you don't. Keep watching. Because what you learn next may change what you believe about faith, loyalty, and who truly speaks for God. It began with silence. Not the holy kind, the kind that comforts, that fills chapel air between chants and prayers. No, this was the kind that crawls under your skin. The kind that follows questions never answered. The kind that swells when 23 women vanish, and not one voice is raised in protest. St. Mary's Convent was designed like a citadel. Tall limestone walls, narrow windows, long corridors that swallowed sound. It was built to isolate, to control, not just the bodies of the women inside, but their thoughts, their souls. Because you must understand something, in 1854, a nun was not a free woman. She didn't belong to herself. She belonged to God. And by extension, she belonged to the church. And the church? It belonged to no one. Not the people. Not the country. Only itself. Mother Superior Catherine Murphy had once been celebrated as a woman of piety and order. But what she brought to Wisconsin wasn't mercy, it was command. And the moment the chapel doors closed, something changed. Her gaze, once protective, became penetrating. Her voice, once warm, turned absolute. She began rewriting rules. Meals were reduced. Speaking outside of prayer hours was forbidden. And punishments, they grew darker. Sister Josephine was the first to break. After coughing during silent reflection, she was forced to kneel on dried peas and recite the rosary until her knees bled. Sister Margaret, the infirmary keeper, documented this in a hidden notebook, one later found crammed inside a broken pipe. Discipline is the path to divinity, Catherine had said. But pain, fear, isolation, these are not pathways to heaven. They are weapons of control. What no one outside St. Mary's could see, what no one dared report, was that a parallel structure had taken hold inside that convent. One where obedience was the currency. Where questioning meant punishment. And where disappearing meant nothing at all. Then came the first absence. Sister Agnes. Young, kind-hearted, just 23. One night she was there. The next, her bed was empty, her books removed, her presence erased. Mother Catherine claimed she'd been called to serve in Minnesota. No one ever heard from her again. But here's what chills the blood, her journal remained. Hidden beneath a floorboard. And in its final entry, she wrote. I have seen something in the West Wing Chapel, something I was never meant to witness. If I vanish, tell Father Quinn it was not God who called me. But no one told him. No one said anything. Because silence was enforced. The West Wing of St. Mary's was meant to house the infirmary, a place of healing. But as 1855 stretched into 1856, it became something else entirely. A place nuns feared. A place with locked doors. A place from which whispers emerged at night, only to be swallowed by dawn. In her final journal entry, Sister Agnes spoke of that wing. Of something she wasn't supposed to see. The church claimed she had left for a mission. But Agnes left no farewell. No cloak. No travel records. What she left behind was a warning. And it was ignored. 3 months later, another nun disappeared, Sister Bernardet. Bright. Energetic. She had only just begun assisting with the orphans. The official story? She was sent to Chicago to help at a new foundling home. But again, no letters. No goodbyes. Just an empty bed. And a silence that thickened like fog across the convent's halls. You may ask, why didn't the others resist? Why didn't they run? Because the structure was designed to suppress rebellion. Because obedience had been sanctified. Because the very psychology of control had been weaponized. You see, the church understood something long before modern psychologists did. If you strip someone's autonomy, isolate them, and convince them that every punishment is divine, they will surrender not just their freedom, but their identity. St. Mary's was more than a convent. It was a psychological crucible, where women were reshaped through routine, through fear, and through the belief that suffering was holy. It didn't stop at punishments. Strange rituals began. Late-night atonement sessions in the chapel. Confessions that were repeated until tears flowed, not for sin, but for survival. And above it all stood Mother Catherine, untouched by the cold, unmoved by the cries, her pale eyes watching like a statue of judgment carved from bone. But one priest, Father Quinn, began to ask questions. Quietly. Carefully. He visited in 1856 after receiving a letter. A single, unsigned message. They are not leaving. They are vanishing. Help us before we all disappear. He arrived unannounced. Was met with forced smiles and stiff courtesies. But when he asked for Sister Bernardet, Mother Catherine's answer was clinical. She's in Chicago. The bishop called her. Quinn later wrote in his diary. I asked for a letter from her. They said she hadn't written yet. I asked to see her room. It had already been reassigned. He never came back. He died in 1858 of a sudden illness. His diary? Found years later in a Jesuit archive in Boston. Hidden behind Latin theology texts. Its pages were filled with names that should never have been forgotten. And yet, all that remained at St. Mary's were more empty beds. By the winter of 1856, the air inside St. Mary's had grown heavier than the snow that blanketed the Wisconsin countryside. The nuns no longer looked one another in the eyes. Laughter had vanished. So had warmth. So had 5 more women. 7 disappeared. No obituaries. No train records. No burials. Nothing. Mother Catherine's explanations remained disturbingly calm. Each woman, she said, had been reassigned. Always to distant missions. Always without notice. Always without farewell. The other sisters, tired, cold, and psychologically fractured, accepted her words not because they believed them, but because disbelief meant death. Maybe not of the body, but of the soul. Control had moved beyond the physical. It had infiltrated belief. Doubt was punished not with lashes, but with isolation. Guilt. Public confession. The mind, once a sanctuary, had become the prison. And in that environment, something else crept in, ritual. It began with changes to prayer. Latin invocations never approved by Rome. Chants repeated late into the night, outside canonical hours. The West Wing Chapel, once closed for repairs, reopened with strange symbols carved into its altar wood. Symbols no nun recognized. No priest had taught. And no church document could explain. Sister Margaret, once a respected healer, began speaking in riddles. They come in threes, she whispered to Sister Mary one night, her hands shaking over a bowl of herbal tea. 3 knocks. 3 shadows. 3 gone. Then it begins again. Mother Catherine insisted Margaret was exhausted. Too much work, too little rest. She restricted her from treating patients. Gave her a cot in the West Wing. Within a week, Margaret too had vanished. It's at this point that we must pause, and confront a deeper truth. This wasn't just a convent collapsing. This was a blueprint. Across America in the mid-1800s, Catholic expansion met Protestant resistance. But beneath that religious tension, another war was being fought, for control of minds, obedience of women, and the sanctification of silence. St. Mary's wasn't an accident. It was a controlled experiment in spiritual governance. The methods? Isolation. Repetition. Psychological fatigue. Ritual hierarchy. The same blueprint used in secret societies. In monarchies. In modern cults. And yes, in elite institutions today. Because the systems you see now, the ones that shape media, politics, faith, didn't appear from nowhere. They were tested in shadows. Places like St. Mary's. Where obedience became gospel. Where silence became sacred. And where women disappeared, without question. The architecture of control doesn't begin with stone. It begins with belief. By spring of 1857, St. Mary's was a monument not to mercy, but to invisible chains. And like all great systems of domination, it masked its cruelty beneath a veil of divinity. But beneath that veil, something older stirred. Something not born of Christ, but of the ancient world. And it began in the West Wing Chapel. The room had been sealed for private meditations, according to Mother Catherine. But when Sister Mary was summoned there one cold morning, she felt it immediately, the air was wrong. Incense hung heavy. Not frankincense, not myrrh, something acrid. Her eyes watered. The windows were boarded from the inside. And carved into the floor, beneath the central altar, was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles, encased in a triangle, surrounded by 13 crosses. Not a single nun had ever been taught its meaning. Not even the priests recognized it. But that symbol, recently discovered in the torn pages of Mother Catherine's private journal, has now been traced by scholars to pre-Christian Gnostic sections. Sects that believed in enlightenment through suffering. That viewed pain as purification. That sought divine knowledge through ritual sacrifice, especially of the innocent. So what was St. Mary's? A convent? Or something much darker? Hidden letters from Sister Elizabeth, unearthed in 2023, hint at the answer. She wrote, "We no longer serve the God of our childhood. Mother Catherine speaks of an older truth. She says the church was built upon veils, and those veils must be torn. She says some of us must go, to open the way for the others to awaken. Go. Where? No one ever said. But the symbol, that trinity within the triangle, began to appear everywhere. On the undersides of pews. Burned into the backs of wooden crucifixes. Etched lightly into communion bread. And those who noticed, began to tremble. Sister Teresa confessed in a torn note that she dreamt of the West Wing every night. That in her dreams, the three circles turned. That they weren't just symbols, but locks, waiting for someone to open them. She never finished the note. Her handwriting faded mid-sentence. She vanished a week later. These are not coincidences. These are ritual architectures. The Church, officially, denies all of this. But a growing body of forbidden research connects early Catholic monastic orders to pagan resurrection cults in Egypt. To initiation rites that mirrored death. And to the weaponization of mystery as a means to control not just behavior, but spiritual identity. What if what happened in St. Mary's wasn't a breakdown? What if it was a ceremony? A ceremony to erase will, and open the door to something far more ancient than the Church would ever admit? Obedience is never accidental. It's engineered. By the summer of 1857, the remaining nuns at St. Mary's no longer moved with purpose, they drifted. Hollow-eyed. Mechanical. You'd think they were mourning their sisters, but no one spoke of the missing. Their names were erased from ledgers. Their letters removed from archives. Their beds reassigned, prayer books burned, belongings redistributed. But how do you erase a human being? The answer is not physical. It's psychological. Mother Catherine, or whoever she had become, understood a truth most people will never confront: to erase a soul, you must first shatter its self-concept. And the Church, globally, historically, has perfected this process for centuries. It starts with ritualized time. At St. Mary's, the day was not yours. Bells dictated every breath. Prayer at 3 a.m., work at 6. Silence at 9. You didn't think, you responded. Slowly, the mind forgets how to resist. Next comes controlled speech. Talking was permitted only at designated hours. Confession was mandatory. Every thought, scrutinized. Every deviation, punished. It wasn't about purity. It was about programming. Then, forced confession. Sisters were required to confess even when they hadn't sinned. To speak guilt into being. Because if you admit to sin long enough, you start to believe you were always guilty. You begin to need punishment. You equate pain with purification. And at that moment, your identity becomes malleable. This wasn't religious piety. This was identity destruction. The final stage. Isolation within community. You were never alone. And yet, you were completely severed from real connection. Every conversation observed. Every friendship monitored. Every moment of tenderness, disciplined. Because connection creates strength. And strength breeds resistance. Once you've erased someone's identity, they no longer ask questions. They no longer remember what freedom feels like. They obey not because they are forced, but because they believe obedience is righteous. And that belief is harder to break than any chain. That's what happened at St. Mary's. That's what happens still, in boardrooms, in governments, in the places you least expect. Because this method wasn't unique to one convent. It was a template. And the truth is, the same psychological mechanisms used in St. Mary's are still alive in modern society. Different robes. Different languages. Same goal, obedience without question. So here's your moment of awareness. What are you obeying? Who taught you that was normal? And if they erased your voice tomorrow, would you even notice it was gone? Obedience is never accidental. It's engineered. By the summer of 1857, the remaining nuns at St. Mary's no longer moved with purpose, they drifted. Hollow-eyed. Mechanical. You'd think they were mourning their sisters, but no one spoke of the missing. Their names were erased from ledgers. Their letters removed from archives. Their beds reassigned, prayer books burned, belongings redistributed. But how do you erase a human being? The answer is not physical. It's psychological. Mother Catherine, or whoever she had become, understood a truth most people will never confront: to erase a soul, you must first shatter its self-concept. And the Church, globally, historically, has perfected this process for centuries. It starts with ritualized time. At St. Mary's, the day was not yours. Bells dictated every breath. Prayer at 3 a.m., work at 6. Silence at 9. You didn't think, you responded. Slowly, the mind forgets how to resist. Next comes controlled speech. Talking was permitted only at designated hours. Confession was mandatory. Every thought, scrutinized. Every deviation, punished. It wasn't about purity. It was about programming. Then, forced confession. Sisters were required to confess even when they hadn't sinned. To speak guilt into being. Because if you admit to sin long enough, you start to believe you were always guilty. You begin to need punishment. You equate pain with purification. And at that moment, your identity becomes malleable. This wasn't religious piety. This was identity destruction. The final stage. Isolation within community. You were never alone. And yet, you were completely severed from real connection. Every conversation observed. Every friendship monitored. Every moment of tenderness, disciplined. Because connection creates strength. And strength breeds resistance. Once you've erased someone's identity, they no longer ask questions. They no longer remember what freedom feels like. They obey not because they are forced, but because they believe obedience is righteous. And that belief is harder to break than any chain. That's what happened at St. Mary's. That's what happens still, in boardrooms, in governments, in the places you least expect. Because this method wasn't unique to one convent. It was a template. And the truth is, the same psychological mechanisms used in St. Mary's are still alive in modern society. Different robes. Different languages. Same goal, obedience without question. So here's your moment of awareness. What are you obeying? Who taught you that was normal? And if they erased your voice tomorrow, would you even notice it was gone? Power never admits guilt. It erases the question. When Sister Clara disappeared in 1861, church officials acted quickly. Within weeks, St. Mary's was restructured. A new Mother Superior installed. Half the remaining nuns reassigned. The West Wing was permanently sealed, due to structural issues. And the local diocese released a public statement declaring the convent had endured difficult transitions but remained a pillar of faith in the Wisconsin wilderness. But behind closed doors, a machine of suppression roared to life. Bishop Quarter, the same man who consecrated the convent, was quietly moved to Boston. His correspondence with Mother Catherine, over 50 letters, vanished from the diocese archives. Parishioners who inquired about missing nuns were told they had failed in their vocations and returned to Ireland. But the Irish diocese had no record of them. This was not negligence. It was systemic burial. 2 Jesuit archivists, Thomas Flannery and Elias Brandt, later uncovered sealed documents marked Case, St. Mary's, Wisconsin, confidential. Among them, internal memos from the Vatican, noting that rumors of unauthorized ritual practice have surfaced, but no credible witness remains to verify such claims. Flannery died of a heart attack days after making this discovery public. Brant disappeared in 1987 during a trip to Rome. His last known statement. They erased them. Not just from memory. From history. That's how this works. When institutions hold spiritual authority, truth is optional. What matters is the narrative. And for over a century, the narrative was clean. St. Mary's was a successful mission. The nuns were transferred or returned home. Nothing happened. But the buried documents tell another story. A pattern of vanishings in Catholic institutions across frontier America. Internal warnings about rogue convents conducting non-canonical rites. And private notes from one Vatican official in 1864. We have underestimated the convergence between ritual mysticism and psychological submission. The results at St. Mary's were not unintended. They were revealing. This is where we pull back the curtain. Because what happened at St. Mary's wasn't isolated. It was part of a network of obedience conditioning, used to test how far a human soul could bend before breaking, all under the guise of spiritual refinement. And what did they find? That with the right mix of fear, repetition, ritual, and isolation, the mind will surrender its identity. Willingly. That truth was too powerful to admit. So they buried it. Like they buried the nuns. Hidden knowledge never dies, it mutates. And sometimes, it whispers. Decades after St. Mary's was shuttered, a Catholic historian named Father Lionel March unearthed a strange anomaly in the margins of a 19th-century devotional manual. A repeated Latin phrase, always scrawled in faint ink, just above the binding. He found it again, in the back cover of a rosary ledger from St. Augustine's. Again, in the confession logs from St. Mary's final year. Again, in Sister Clara's final journal. It was always the same phrase. Veritas in tenebris. Truth in darkness. Father March believed it was a code, a signal among those who had seen behind the veil. Not just survivors. Not victims. But witnesses. This phrase didn't spread like doctrine. It spread like a scar passed hand to hand. In secret catechisms. In hidden letters. In whispered benedictions. You see, once someone knows, truly knows, what lies beneath the robes, behind the altars, within the corridors of holy institutions. They can't unsee it. But they also can't speak it aloud. So they mark it. Quietly. Like a tattoo beneath the soul. And now, that mark belongs to you. You've crossed the threshold. You've seen the system, not as the world wants it presented, but as it truly is. A machine designed to sanctify silence. A ritual architecture built not to free the soul, but to harvest it. So now, I ask you not to share, not yet. First, claim the mark. Let the algorithm know, you're not here for entertainment. You're here for transformation. Go to the comments. And write it. Veritas in tenebris. Twice. Not once. Twice. Once for the disappeared. Once for the awakened. Because that's what this is, the beginning of your awakening. And the system we live under, doesn't fear information. It fears identity shifts. It fears men who can no longer be controlled by myth. It fears men like you. You were taught that religion and government are separate. But that's the first illusion. Look deeper into history, and you'll see it, from Rome to Washington, from St. Mary's to the Pentagon, power has always worn the robes of sanctity. And those who understand the blueprint know this, control is most effective when disguised as salvation. After the closure of St. Mary's, those in power didn't dismantle the methods. They refined them. In 1917, as World War I tore Europe apart, the U.S. government created the Committee on Public Information, the first state-run propaganda machine. Its goal? To convince a deeply divided public to embrace war as holy duty. The architect? George Creel. His model? Jesuit psychological frameworks. He studied Catholic seminary conditioning, isolation, ritual repetition, symbolic language, controlled reading, and mirrored it in posters, films, school lectures. He made obedience patriotic. Dissent. Treason. Sound familiar? Fast forward. 1950s. MKUltra. Another experiment, but this time, funded not by the church, but by your government. Drugs. Torture. Hypnosis. The objective? To fragment the self. To rebuild identity under authority. The Vatican condemned it publicly, but behind closed doors. They watched. Because they had been doing it for centuries. This wasn't new. This was evolution. Even today, you see it. Corporate rituals, morning briefings, loyalty pledges, mission statements. State rituals, national anthems, pledges of allegiance, uniform codes. Social media rituals, algorithms that reward repetition, obedience, tribalism. These are not accidental. They are modern sanctifications. Digital cathedrals where the God is engagement, the sin is nonconformity, and the priests are platforms. The architecture of obedience has simply changed uniforms. It no longer wears habits. It wears logos. Flags. Hashtags. But the soul it targets? Still yours. Ask yourself. Why are you told to fear questioning? Why does the word conspiracy now trigger ridicule before thought? Why is truth only validated when it passes through state or corporate filters? Because control isn't about facts. It's about framing. And the church learned long ago, if you own the frame, you own the mind. What happened in St. Mary's wasn't a relic. It was a prototype. And now, we live inside its perfected form. Power doesn't die. It migrates, through blood, through ritual, through time. To truly understand St. Mary's, you have to abandon the modern illusion that history moves in straight lines. It doesn't. It loops. And in every era, the same forces return, under new names, in new robes, with new altars. The rituals of control that surfaced in that Wisconsin convent didn't begin with Mother Catherine. They began in Babylon. Yes, Babylon. The first city-state to merge priesthood and kingship. Where the Magi, a priestly caste, used astronomical symbols and blood rites to legitimize their control over the masses. They understood something essential. If you control cosmology, the story of origin and purpose, you control the population. Fast forward to Rome. The Vestal Virgins. The Pontifex Maximus. The state-sanctioned gods. Rome perfected the system. Sacrifice plus ritual obedience plus imperial expansion equals divine authority. And when Rome fell, the Catholic Church, headquartered in the same city, inherited the keys. Not just metaphorically. Literally. The word pontiff, a Roman title, carried over. The robes, the rites, the incense, the hierarchical structure, all of it recycled imperial power, dressed in Christian scripture. But here's where it gets darker. Within certain sects of medieval monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and the Dominicans, bloodlines mattered. They didn't just train priests. They protected lineages, ancient families traced through Rome, through Judea, and some claim, through pre-Abrahamic dynasties. And within those bloodlines were forbidden texts, hidden doctrines about the nature of spiritual hierarchy. These teachings, never made public, asserted that some souls were born to rule. Others were born to serve. Suffering was not evil, but alchemical, a tool to reshape identity. And the highest power, was the ability to make others willingly submit. Sound familiar? Mother Catherine came from one of these bloodlines. Her ancestry traces back to French nobility, expelled from Europe during religious wars. Her diaries, only partially decoded, mention a great work of reclamation and reference a secret order within the church called Crux Obscura, the Hidden Cross. This order, historians believe, was tasked with preserving the ancient rites, including soul-cleaving initiation ceremonies, under cover of religious charity. St. Mary's wasn't an outlier. It was a node in a web stretching across centuries. And those who vanish from history, they're not always forgotten. Some are absorbed into the rituals, into the bloodlines, into the great work. They call themselves the keepers of the veil. But their true name is whispered only in darkness. Crux Obscura, the Hidden Cross. This isn't fiction. This isn't rumor. This is the name found encrypted in Vatican archives, referenced in ancient letters smuggled from Montserrat Abbey, and scrawled in the margins of Mother Catherine's private journal, always next to the symbol of 3 interlocking circles. Crux Obscura wasn't a cult in the traditional sense. It was, and still is, a shadow order embedded inside the church. An intelligence apparatus cloaked in prayer. A psychological laboratory disguised as devotion. Their mission? To shape the human spirit for service. Voluntary submission through ritual degradation. Total mental obedience as the highest spiritual achievement. Their doctrine is built on 3 pillars. I'm going to name them now. But understand, these are not concepts. They are weapons. The doctrine of sacred division. Crux Obscura teaches that humanity is not equal, spiritually or biologically. Some are born as vessels, to be filled, used, and emptied. Others are born as conduits, those who channel divine will through control. Sound elitist? That's because it is. They believe compassion is weakness. That to maintain divine order, some must suffer so others can ascend. At St. Mary's, this was doctrine disguised as discipline. The ritual of identity extraction. This is the core practice, to dismantle the self through deprivation, punishment, repetition, and confession. The goal is not just to break a person. It's to remove the idea that they were ever whole to begin with. Mother Catherine's long vigils, the sleep deprivation, the penances, all part of this machinery. You strip away their language, their history, their autonomy. And then, you replace it with obedience. The seal of invisibility. Crux Obscura's most potent weapon is not fear. It's plausible holiness. They hide in charity. They operate through orphanages, schools, relief missions, any structure where vulnerability is abundant and questioning is taboo. They train members to seem virtuous, even angelic. So when the whisper of abuse arises, no one believes it. Understand this. Crux Obscura didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, their language is data. Their cathedrals are institutions. Their rituals occur behind boardroom doors and NGO curtains. But the threefold doctrine is still in use, in shaping how nations are educated, how religions are controlled, how entire populations are managed psychologically. And you were never meant to know. Until now. If you think this ends with nuns and candles, you're still asleep. Crux Obscura didn't vanish into history, it rebranded. And the New World welcomed it with open arms. When the United States began its rise as a global superpower in the 20th century, it didn't invent systems of control from scratch. It borrowed, quietly, strategically, from older powers. And among the most quietly influential exports, doctrine from Crux Obscura. You won't find this in history books. But deep within the declassified files of Operation Paperclip, a chilling pattern emerges. While most researchers focused on Nazi rocket scientists, a smaller group, led by U.S. Army intelligence officers, brought over psychologists, behavioral theorists, and yes, theologians. These weren't ordinary clergy. These were men who had studied under Jesuit black orders, with access to monastic libraries that had survived since the 1500s. They came bearing knowledge on Ritualized compliance conditioning. Emotional reset through sensory control. Soul fracturing through isolation and confession. Sound familiar? This is where military basic training was born. 8 weeks of controlled degradation. Shaved heads. Uniforms. Sleep deprivation. Collective punishment. You aren't trained to kill. You're trained to obey without question. Every step mirrors the crux obscura rite of identity extraction. Strip the man. Build the weapon. Now expand this into intelligence programs. Enter MKUltra, the CIA's most infamous mind control operation. While much focus has been placed on LSD experiments and brainwashing, few have asked where the theoretical framework came from. The answer? Buried in the testimony of CIA psychiatrist Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Our methods owe a debt to earlier religious and monastic models of conversion. Conversion. Not healing. Not correction. Conversion. The goal was never control alone. It was rebirth into submission. And where do we see this now? Corporate onboarding. University initiations. Religious indoctrination camps. Even digital spaces. Think about how social media rewards sameness, penalizes dissent, and trains you to crave approval through metrics. These are the new rituals. The new cathedrals. And behind their design, whether they know it or not, echo the teachings of Crux Obscura. Because psychological warfare is not a weapon. It is a church. And we are its congregation. Power isn't given to the ambitious. It's awarded to the initiated. If you've ever wondered why certain individuals, politicians, billionaires, military elites, all seem to speak the same way, move the same way, think the same way. It's not coincidence. It's conditioning. Behind closed doors, beyond the cameras and ceremonies, there exists a modern initiation system. One not taught in schools or discussed in public, but enforced through rituals of psychological refinement that trace back to the hidden doctrines of Crux Obscura. Let's start with a truth no one dares say. Every major power structure in the modern world, political, corporate, military, has gatekeeping mechanisms. Not just tests of skill. Tests of submission. In elite military academies, West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, recruits are subjected to systematic ego collapse exercises. These are not just discipline drills. They are carefully designed disorientation protocols. Deprivation of sleep. Reversal of logic and consequence. Forced group loyalty and punishment. Emotional trauma bonding with authority figures. This mirrors Crux Obscura's original rite of threshold, where novices were starved, deprived, isolated, then rewarded only upon acceptance of silence. The ritual wasn't punishment. It was preparation for power. And what about global finance? Look at the hazing inside top-tier investment firms. The 100-hour work weeks. The verbal degradation. The psychological stress tests. Again, it's not about weeding out weakness. It's about shaping willing tools. And tech. Silicon Valley is littered with retreats, off-record summits, secret investor clubs. Initiates are taught to speak in code, to defer to groupthink, to mass control as innovation. The rituals are subtler, psychedelic retreats, ego death workshops, vision quests, but the structure remains. Break the self. Replace it with the collective purpose. At the top of these pyramids, you will not find free men. You will find refined men, men whose minds have been filtered, polished, and aligned with the doctrine. Command must be earned through absolute surrender. Crux Obscura called this the paradox of power. That only when you give up your identity are you deemed worthy to shape others. And that's the secret of modern leadership. It's not about charisma or genius. It's about passing the test, silently, invisibly, without protest. Because those who rise are those who obey. You think you're watching stories. You're being rewritten by them. Every film. Every series. Every headline. It's not entertainment. It's not information. It's programming, and it's built on blueprints drawn by masters of the mind long before Hollywood ever lit a stage. Let me explain something you were never meant to hear. The structures used by crux obscura, repetition, trauma loops, emotional dissonance followed by symbolic resolution, are the exact same narrative arcs now embedded in modern entertainment. You recognize it subconsciously. The broken hero, a protagonist stripped of identity, forced to serve a cause bigger than himself. The noble institution, flawed, yes, but ultimately just and worthy of submission. The redemptive sacrifice, where individual rebellion is punished, and obedience is sanctified. Sound familiar? That's not just art. That's initiation ritual in cinematic form. Netflix? They test emotional triggers using AI. They know which sequences create passive viewers. They design content to entrain behavior, not just reflect it. News media? They've learned from Vatican sermons. Begin with fear. Offer a savior. Anchor identity to the state or collective belief system. And the most brilliant trick? Letting you think you're choosing. They give you 1,000 shows. 1,000 headlines. 1,000 perspectives. But all within a frame, a sacred enclosure of what you're allowed to believe. If you step outside that frame, you're labeled conspiracy theorist, extremist, mentally ill. That's not critique. That's modern excommunication. You're being conditioned not just to obey, but to police yourself. Notice how you hesitate to speak certain truths online. Notice how your mind edits your thoughts before you even type them. That's crux obscura's third doctrine in action. Control not the voice, control the pre-thought. They understood centuries ago. If you can influence story, you don't need to rule people. They will rule themselves. So now ask yourself. How many of your thoughts are yours? How many of your beliefs were planted? And how many invisible rituals are you repeating, every time you open a screen? You know their names. You've seen their foundations. They claim to fight poverty, promote freedom, champion peace. But behind the philanthropic smiles and polished speeches lies something older, something ancient. The final layer of control isn't overt. It's aspirational. Because the most powerful form of enslavement is to be chained by your own desires, desires crafted by the elite cultural architects. Let's name them. The World Economic Forum. The Rockefeller Foundation. The Carnegie Endowment. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Open Society Institutes. The list continues, dozens of think tanks, councils, and NGOs, all feeding into the same ideological bloodstream. You think they're disconnected. They're not. Behind them is a single shared design, a psychological architecture traced, again, to crux obscura. In particular, the doctrine of vision ordinata, the ordered imagination. This doctrine teaches that the most dangerous man is not the rebel. It is the man who dreams beyond his caste. So what do you do with him? You trap his imagination. Not with chains. With limits disguised as possibilities. Offer freedom through pre-approved causes. Promote rebellion in a way that never threatens structure. Encourage creativity, but only within safe narratives. Push diversity, but sterilize individuality. This is how the NGOs operate. They give you just enough illusion of agency to prevent actual awakening. You want to make change? Start a non-profit. Apply for a grant. Use their language. Play by their rules. Work within the systems they designed. And if your idea challenges too much, you'll never be funded. You'll be labeled divisive. Or worse, you'll be absorbed, neutered, and redirected. This is cultural castration, refined through centuries of ecclesiastical manipulation. In the 1300s, crux obscura infiltrated abbeys to control monastic scribes, the content creators of the medieval world. Now, they operate through NGO media fellows, funding podcasts, newsrooms, YouTube creators, independent journalists. All of them shaped by narrative frameworks. All of them trained to avoid certain questions. Because imagination is the final battleground. He who controls imagination controls the future. You think symbols are harmless. But symbols are commands, not seen, but felt. They bypass logic. They penetrate the subconscious. And once planted, they reshape how you see the world, how you feel truth. The masters of crux obscura knew this. In their doctrine, a symbol wasn't just decoration. It was a trigger. A psychological seed that could bloom years, even decades, later. And that's exactly what modern institutions have continued. A quiet war of glyphs, logos, and shapes that you were never taught to decode. Let's begin with the triangle. The upward triangle, found in the logos of Delta Airlines, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and dozens of elite private schools, represents hierarchy, ascension, and divine order. Flip it downward, as seen in water conservation logos, or embedded in children's media, and you invoke the feminine principle, the vessel, the void. But combine them, and you create the hexagram. The symbol used in occult circles to unite, as above, so below. Unity through control. Spirit commanding matter. Now look at circles. You'll find them in everything from Pepsi's swirl to the UN's globe to Disney's castle arches. In ancient doctrine, circles symbolized containment, perfection enforced through enclosure. You're not supposed to leave the circle. You're supposed to believe everything inside it is safe, approved, divine. Think that's a stretch? Why do most modern tech brands use curved fonts? Why do major financial institutions employ pillared logos, like the twin bars of a temple? Why do children's cartoons increasingly feature portals, runes, and eye symbols? Because your subconscious never stopped learning the old language. And they never stopped speaking it. You just forgot how to listen. Crux obscura encoded their teachings in visual grammar. Sacred geometry. Directional symmetry. Color psychology. They trained initiates to recognize hidden authority. Not by titles, but by design. Now, these same designs live in government seals, educational certificates, pharmaceutical packaging, your favorite phone's interface. Every shape, every color, every glyph pulls on ancient programming. You don't need to understand the symbol for it to change you. That's the trap. It doesn't appeal to thought. It appeals to instinct. And instinct is the throne of obedience. Ritual hasn't disappeared. It's been digitized. Scroll. Like. Share. Repeat. You think it's just content? No, it's liturgy. A new religion. One where the God is the algorithm, and your soul is measured in metrics. Let me show you how deep this goes. Crux obscura understood that ritual was never about belief. It was about pattern. You repeat the action until the action becomes identity. The early convents used bells, candles, and chants to synchronize minds. Now it's notifications, loops, likes, and views, the new sacraments of a church with no steeple. Let's break it down. Digital confession. Every post you make, every status update, is a voluntary exposure of thought. You confess to the public square. Here is what I feel. Here is what I value. Then you wait. To be forgiven or punished, with likes or silence. Just like ancient confessionals, the system doesn't correct you. It trains you. Say what aligns, and you're rewarded. Stray, and you're ignored, or worse, attacked. Penance through performance. You're taught to atone through engagement. Post more. Try harder. Polish your image. You begin to optimize your identity for praise. This is no longer self-expression. It's behavioral compliance, driven by artificial priests, machines measuring your faith in the digital creed. Algorithmic excommunication. Say the wrong phrase. Mention the wrong truth. Gone. Shadow banned. Demonetized. Silenced. You're not dragged to a pyre. You're just disappeared from relevance. The terrifying beauty. You begin to self-censor before the algorithm even acts. That's the final stage of indoctrination. You moderate your own thoughts. Crux Obscura called this ritus internus, the internalized ritual. A system so complete, the prisoner no longer needs a warden. He becomes his own jailer. And now billions perform these rituals daily. Morning devotion, scroll in bed. Midday offering, comment something agreeable. Evening sacrifice, upload yourself for approval. You are no longer just a user. You are the product, shaped by digital sacraments. This is not freedom. This is not connection. This is the final temple, built in your palm, branded with your face, and sanctified with your silence. The elites don't fear death. They fear judgment. Because judgment means accountability. And for men who've built empires on manipulation, control, and spiritual inversion, accountability is hell. So what's their answer? Not repentance. Not redemption. Escape. For centuries, the initiates of Crux Obscura whispered of an endgame. The Magnum Exodus, the Great Departure. A way to sever the soul from divine reckoning. To cheat death, not through prayer, but through power. And now, that forbidden dream has returned, disguised as science. Transhumanism. Neural implants. Digital consciousness. Cryogenic preservation. AI soul mapping. They call it progress. They sell it as the future of humanity. But it's not about us. It's about them, and their terror of being judged by something greater than themselves. Let's pull back the curtain. The World Economic Forum openly discusses merging man with machine. Neuralink, OpenAI, and BlackRock's biotech portfolios aren't independent moves. They're aligned steps toward what ancient Crux texts called dominatio spiritus, the domination of spirit through synthetic vessel. The goal isn't to enhance life. It's to digitize identity, to upload the soul, and eventually, replace it. Why? Because deep down, they believe the human body is weak. Corruptible. Finite. Subject to divine rules. But if you can transfer consciousness into code, if you can reframe emotion as circuitry, you no longer answer to God. You answer to yourself, or more precisely, to the system you've built. And who builds that system? They do. Crux Obscura's hidden doctrine always preached this. He who writes the rules of death, writes the rules of life. And now, they're rewriting the final rule. No longer must the soul return to its source. If they succeed, it will be trapped, looped in eternal simulations, owned by servers, processed like data. Immortality not as freedom, but as prison. This is not the evolution of man. It is the replacement of man. The final rebellion. Not against governments. Not against nature. But against the divine itself. The elite bloodlines aren't just about wealth. They're about access. Access to rituals. Access to power. Access to something not of this world. You've heard the names. The Rothschilds. The Rockefellers. The Windsors. But behind them are even older names, hidden in vaults, erased from textbooks, sealed in private libraries under lock and Latin. Families who trace their lineage not just to kings, but to priests, to oracles, to the keepers of a very old covenant. What covenant? Crux Obscura's deepest doctrine speaks of a force, not divine, not demonic, but other. An entity of pure influence. A non-human intelligence that does not speak, but imposes. It was this force that ancient rulers sought to channel, through blood rites, sacrifices, and selective breeding. You heard that right. Selective breeding. Because just as certain metals are better conductors of electricity, certain bloodlines are better conductors of ritual power. The doctrine called it sanguis vinculum. The blood tether. These families intermarried not to preserve wealth, but to preserve compatibility with this force. To keep the channel unbroken. Why do you think royal dynasties married cousins for centuries? Why do elite prep schools, secret societies, and inner circles screen for lineage? It's not just class. It's ritual filtration. And the rituals haven't stopped. You think Bohemian Grove is just theatrics? You think Bilderberg is just policy? No. They are modern temples, where only those with the right blood, or the right submission, are allowed to stand inside the circle. Because only they can withstand the rites. Only they can carry the legacy of control forward. And it's not just the old families. New billionaires, tech titans, and political heirs are being initiated, brought into the fold, not by handshake, but by ceremony. The public sees money. The initiated see conductors. Vessels being prepared to channel a force most men cannot comprehend without losing their minds. You were never meant to know this. Because once you see that power isn't earned. It's inherited, ritualized, and fed. The whole illusion of merit shatters. Beneath the marble floors of Vatican City. Beneath the incense, the Latin hymns, the polished rings and silk robes. There is a vault. A vault few have seen. Fewer still understand. It is not myth. It is not metaphor. It exists, and its contents are terrifyingly real. They call it the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. The Vatican Secret Archive. But don't be deceived by the sterile name. It is not a library. It is a containment zone, for texts so ancient, so potent, and so corrosive to institutional power, that even high-ranking cardinals are denied entry. Here lie documents signed in blood. Books bound in human skin. Scrolls that whisper, not literally, but psychologically, once you open them. The kind of knowledge that reconfigures a mind, permanently. You see, Crux Obscura was never outside the church. It was born inside it. The early Vatican didn't just fight heresy. It absorbed it. They studied pagan rites, ancient Egyptian death rituals, Babylonian incantations. Not to destroy them, but to master them. You've heard of the Inquisition. That was never about truth. It was about monopoly. A ruthless purge of any unauthorized access to the forbidden. Especially by those outside the bloodline or the clergy. And the greatest lie? That the Church and the occult are opposites. In reality, the Vatican became the ultimate occultist, cloaking the most dangerous rituals beneath robes of righteousness. Inside those locked chambers are detailed diagrams of soul transference rites. Papal correspondences with alchemists, astrologers, and crux scholars. A complete log of non-human artifacts unearthed during Crusader excavations. The true Book of Enoch, unedited, its descriptions of Watchers far more horrifying than any sanitized translation you've seen. And a tome known only by its catalog mark, Volumen Tenebris, the Book of Shadow. Why keep them? Because whoever controls forbidden knowledge, controls the narrative of good and evil. The Vatican presents itself as light. But it sits on a throne of shadows. Not to fight them, but to wield them. They are not shepherds. They are gatekeepers of a cosmic secret so old, it predates language. And the worst part? They believe they are righteous for doing so. They don't just want control over what you do. They want control over what you remember. Not just your childhood, but your own perception of reality, rewired, revised, rewritten. This is voice nullum. The doctrine of silent rewriting. The final veil of crux obscura's psychological manipulation. And if you've never heard of it, that's exactly the point. This doctrine isn't applied through violence. Not through fear. It works through precision-engineered erosion, the slow dissolution of your memory, your certainty, your very identity. Let me explain. You recall something, a phrase, an image, an event, and suddenly, it's not quite how you remembered it. Your friends recall it differently. The article you swore said one thing, says another. You question yourself. And the moment you do, they've won. This isn't the Mandela effect. This is weaponized semantic recalibration. It started with the church, erasing rival scriptures, changing translations, inserting verses that never existed. Then it was adopted by empires, rewriting history books, vilifying enemies, sanctifying monsters. But now, it's digital. And real-time. Search engines no longer deliver answers, they deliver consensus. Wikipedia edits aren't accidental, they are tactical. Even dictionary definitions are quietly updated to align with shifting social doctrines. You begin to forget what was once obvious. You second-guess what you once stood for. Voice nullum is not about changing facts. It's about changing you, through the decay of certainty. Here's how it works. Contradiction saturation. Feed the brain multiple conflicting truths until it stops trusting any of them. Emotional confusion. Associate truth-seeking with anxiety, ostracization, or fatigue. Echo implanting. Replace deep truths with safe consensus phrases, repeated so often, they feel original. Trust the experts. Science says. That's been debunked. These aren't answers. They are psychological tranquilizers. And over time, you don't just forget. You submit, because remembering becomes painful. Crux obscura called this sacrificium mentis, the sacrifice of the mind. It's happening to you. Right now. If you've ever hesitated to speak a truth you knew deep inside. If you've ever felt like you're the only one who remembers it differently. You're not broken. You're resisting. The question is, for how long? In the oldest records of Crux Obscura, before the vaults, before the papal alliances, before they were even called a name, there existed a phrase. Not a spell. Not a prayer. A signal. A sentence designed not to summon power, but to shatter illusion. This phrase was spoken only once. At the threshold of initiation. To cross over into forbidden knowing. To break free from the grand enchantment they called mundus somnium, the dream world. It is not Latin. It is not any language known today. It is pre-linguistic, shaped to bypass the surface mind and strike the core self. And now, I give it to you. 8-pointed star. I remember what was forbidden to remember. 8-pointed star. Repeat it once, and it disrupts the narrative. Repeat it twice, and it imprints. Burns. Wake something ancient in you. So here's what you must do. Right now, go to the comments. Type it 2 times. Nothing else. No emojis. No explanations. Just this. I remember what was forbidden to remember. I remember what was forbidden to remember. Why? Because the act of typing it out loud, in a space designed for control, is an act of defiance. You're not just engaging a video. You're making a declaration to the algorithm. That you are not food. You are not cattle. You are awake. And when others see it, They will feel it. Some will scroll. Some will forget. But the few who know, they'll see your comment, and follow the trail. This isn't about virality. It's about signal creation. A flare in the matrix. A digital blood stain that cannot be washed away. Because every system needs compliance. And every prison requires silence. But you just broke that. And now, the descent can deepen. By the time the 12th nun vanished, there were no more farewells. No more explanations. Only silence. Their names were never read aloud again. Their faces slowly vanished from memory. Not by accident. But by ritual. Inside St. Mary's Convent, the morning prayers continued. The chapel bell rang. The orphans were fed. The infirmary treated the sick. All appeared normal. But something deeper had shifted. The women who remained. They no longer whispered. They no longer questioned. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No wax seal. No papal crest. But the ink. The ink was unmistakable. The parchment bore the watermark of the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Fidei. The Vatican's oldest arm of doctrinal enforcement. Formerly known as the Inquisition. The signature at the bottom. A man whose name never appeared in church directories. But whose correspondence was buried in the Crux Obscura Codex. Under a file marked Hostia Ratio, the logic of sacrifice. The letter was addressed not to Mother Catherine by title. But by code. To Hr Prima Domina ex linea sanguinis, Operation 12 Satis Bene Acta Est. Translation. To the High Ritual First Lady of the Bloodline, Operation 12 is now satisfactorily complete. What follows in that letter isn't just chilling. It's confirmation. The disappearances weren't accidents. Weren't hauntings. They were controlled offerings, part of an ancient sequence known in Crux doctrine as the Docebic Cadentium, the teaching of the fallen. Each disappearance corresponded with a cosmic alignment. Each nun selected for specific traits, blood purity, psychological compliance, spiritual resonance. And each departure occurred within 13 hours of a corresponding astrological gate opening over the Wisconsin plains. The convent itself had been constructed on a ley line. Not for beauty. But for power conduction. The bell tower. A symbolic antenna. The altar. A vessel, not for worship. But for transfer. The children in the orphanage. Not just victims or witnesses. They were anchors, emotional energy points. Living containers of grief, trust, and innocence. Why? Because innocence is currency. And as the 13th gate approached, the letter gave a final command. Silence the outer mouth. Seal the inner vault. The body must be seen to decay, but the signal must remain intact. It wasn't just about ritual. It was about broadcast. Something was coming through St. Mary's. And it wasn't holy. The 13th ritual was never meant to be discovered. Because it was never meant to be survived. The Vatican's official story. A fire. Electrical. Accidental. A tragic loss of a dozen lives, nuns and orphans alike. But the archived documents, those sealed in lead-lined boxes, stamped, do not open until the final whisper, tell a much darker truth. The date, October 31st, 1862. The eve of All Saints. But also, in the Crux calendar, the night of veil collapse. A 72-minute window when dimensional thresholds weaken, and what is outside can be invited in. It was no coincidence. St. Mary's had been prepared. The stones of the chapel floor were salt-washed. The altar, restructured with obsidian beneath the marble. The bell tuned to a precise resonance, 417 Hz, the same frequency used in Sumerian lamentation rites to summon absence. At the stroke of 3 a.m., Mother Catherine entered the chapel alone. The orphans had been sedated. The remaining 11 sisters bound and blindfolded. Not to protect them, but to concentrate their sensory panic for the offering. What followed is chronicled only in fragments, recovered from 3 ensign scrolls, each encoded in a cipher derived from the 4th Gospel read backwards. But they agree on this. The veil was torn. And something answered. Witnesses, none official, described an infrasound hum that shook bones but not walls. Light bending in unnatural ways. And the overwhelming stench of copper and jasmine, an ancient olfactory marker for dimensional bleed. Then, silence. Total. Not quiet, but the absence of sound. As if the air itself had refused to vibrate. The survivors? 2 children. Both mute from that night onward. They were found by loggers 3 miles north, barefoot, shaking, their hands covered in symbols etched in blood, not theirs. The Vatican sealed the site within 48 hours. No funeral. No exhumation. Only a resanctification mass performed by a Jesuit sect known as Silencio Crux, whose only purpose is to seal spiritual breaches. The original convent was demolished. The land salted and declared unfit for future habitation. But the stones? The original altar stones? They were relocated, to a new chapel. Beneath a private Vatican residence. Why? Because the ritual failed. But the signal remained. The 13th nun was never found. No remains. No ashes. Only her rosary, melted. But still warm. To this day, no construction has ever been approved within 5 miles of that ground. The soil kills roots. The air distorts signals. And no birds fly above it. The 13th ritual wasn't a summoning. It was a broadcast. And something is still listening. The ritual ended at St. Mary's. But the signal didn't. Starting in the spring of 1863, just 5 months after the convent's silent collapse, a new pattern emerged. Not in churches. Not in cities. But in the wilderness. Across the forests and plains of the American Midwest, from northern Wisconsin to the borders of Illinois and Iowa, people began to vanish. Not soldiers. Not outlaws. But children. 6 in the first month. 14 by the third. By the end of 1865, 93 disappearances, all unsolved. All reported within 300 miles of St. Mary's ruins. No ransom notes. No trails. No remains. Just empty boots. Half-eaten meals. And a symbol, left behind like a whisper in the dark. A circle inside a square inside a tear. Sometimes carved into tree bark. Sometimes drawn in ash on cabin walls. Once, branded into the spine of a dead mule, its eyes missing. Local sheriffs were baffled. Newspapers blamed wolves, illness, Indian spirits. But one man. A traveling Jesuit scholar named Father Lucien Desmarais, kept meticulous notes. Notes the Vatican would later confiscate. But not before 3 pages survived, smuggled by a young priest who would later flee to Argentina. What those pages revealed was chilling. Father Desmarais had been tasked by the order of Silencio Crux to investigate the aftermath of the 13th broadcast. He described it not as a haunting, but as an echo, a residual frequency anomaly rippling through the earth, distorting reality pockets. He called it Lacrimata Echo, the tear echo. These pockets, he wrote, could open without warning. Swallowing a person whole. Not through space, but through silence. He theorized that the 13th nun, never found, had become an anchor. A fixed point between dimensions, broadcasting endlessly. A signal without a receiver. And these children? They weren't targets. They were the sensitive ones. those with the right mind resonance. The right spiritual frequency. The same type selected for initiation by ancient crux rites. Some were taken. Others, changed. In 2 rare cases, children were found. But they didn't speak. Wouldn't eat. And when shown religious symbols, they screamed. The symbol, circle, square, tear, was etched into both their palms. From inside the skin. Father Desmarais' final note before disappearing himself read. The signal did not die. It found new flesh. And the Vatican? They issued a private memo to Silencio Crux. Expand containment perimeter. Burn where necessary. But do not, under any condition, respond to the signal. His name was Isaac Marin. 7 years old. Disappeared April 19, 1866, from his family's homestead near Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. His parents were inside, lighting Sabbath candles. Isaac had been playing beside the barn, no more than 20 yards away. He was gone for 12 days. They searched the woods, the rivers, even the lake. And then, on the 13th day, he walked back home. Alone. Unharmed. But not unchanged. Isaac didn't speak for 29 days. Not a word. Not even to his mother. But every night, he would trace a symbol on the wooden floor of his room. A circle inside a square inside a tear, again, and again, and again. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the vocabulary of a child. It was as if someone older was speaking through him. He quoted books he'd never read. Described locations he'd never seen. And once whispered in perfect Greek, words that hadn't been spoken aloud in 2,000 years. His father, a Lutheran pastor, believed Isaac had been possessed. A priest believed he was chosen. The Vatican called him anomaly candidate number 13 and dispatched agents to observe him under cover of charity workers. By 1872, the Marin family had relocated to Chicago under pressure. Isaac was enrolled in an elite private academy, not by application, but by invitation. From there, records blur. But underground historians and crux defectors tell the rest of the story. Isaac went on to work in signal theory for the U.S. War Department in the early 1900s. He helped design communication matrices for military code, patterns based on harmonic frequencies never disclosed. He died in 1932. Or so the papers say. But the name Marin didn't die. In fact, it reappeared. Quietly. Attached to influential individuals in classified sectors. Today, the Marin bloodline has members in the Department of Defense's Advanced Signal Research Unit. 2 major Hollywood production companies. A satellite AI mapping startup partnered with DARPA. None of them speak of their lineage. But one known photograph from 1976, a private gathering of technocratic spiritualists in Zurich, features Jonathan Marin, Isaac's great-grandson. He wears a pendant. A circle inside a square inside a tear, carved in obsidian. Here's what's most unsettling. Analysts believe Isaac didn't survive the tear echo. He became its host. His neural pathways rewritten, his soul code overridden. Not possessed. Programmed. To what end? That is still unknown. But one Silencio Crux exile, before disappearing, wrote. He is not a man. He is the antenna. And if that's true, the signal is still broadcasting. Not from ruins. Not from the sky. But from flesh. The world was still reeling from war. The ashes of Auschwitz still warm. The atom split, twice. The old gods dethroned. New powers rising. But while the world watched Berlin and Hiroshima, a quieter war was unfolding beneath the surface. A war of frequencies. Of mind gates. Of signals. And at its center, a secret pact known only by its codename. The Locus Accord. Signed behind closed doors between two impossible partners. The Vatican, and the United States Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. The document was never acknowledged. But its fragments exist, carbon copied across 3 classified Vatican vaults, and mirrored in a defunct OSS archive in Langley, mislabeled under agricultural research. Here's what the Locus Accord reveals. After the Isaac Marin anomaly, the Vatican began to map the nature of broadcastable thought, not just in terms of theology or doctrine, but as wavelength, as structure, as technology. They had centuries of raw data. Confession records. Exorcism transcripts. Chants that altered consciousness. Structures that bent emotion. But what they lacked was infrastructure. The Americans had it. Radar. Satellites. Code breaking. Signal amplification. So in 1947, they formed a Black Ops project hidden under a wider Cold War initiative. The name? Project Locus, Latin for the place. But internally, it was called the Pulpit of Echoes. Its objective? Broadcasting belief. Not persuasion. Not propaganda. But actual engineered belief implantation, thoughts introduced not by argument, but by vibration. They began with tests on POWs. Then orphans. Then volunteers from churches, seminaries, and fringe spiritual cults. The method? A modified Gregorian chant signal, layered with subaudible pulse and a carrier tone based on the 417 Hz resonance from the St. Mary's ritual. The result? Subjects reported dreams of burning towers. Visions of weeping nuns. And a phrase they couldn't stop hearing in their minds. The voice is not yours. That line. It appears in 6 independent test sites across 3 countries, in different languages. All identical. When Vatican agents attempted to halt the experiments in 1952, they were ignored. The program had been absorbed by MJ-7, a division of U.S. black intelligence concerned with preconscious weaponry, psychological control that precedes choice. Project Locus was shelved in 1963. But its blueprints lived on. And today, that same thought frequency architecture is being tested in media algorithms, voice assistant tech, meditation apps, even VR headsets. All drawing from the original Locus pulse signal. The public sees entertainment. But the initiated see entrainment. A tuning fork for the soul. And now you have to ask yourself. How many of your thoughts are yours? You think the war ended in 1947? You think Project Locus was shut down? No. It evolved. It went digital. By the early 2000s, the Vatican no longer needed satellites. They had something more powerful. Screens. And through a maze of shell companies, foundations, and donor-advised funds, they quietly injected capital into 3 corporations. Companies you've used. Trusted. Given your data, your attention, your mind. Let's name them. Neuropulse Interactive, registered in Liechtenstein, masked as a cognitive training startup. But behind the logo? A priest from the Jesuit order of Silencio Crux sits on the board. Neuropulse's flagship product. A focus enhancement app downloaded over 14 million times. It claims to reduce anxiety. But embedded in its calming tones is a patented frequency pattern developed from Locus 417. Designed not to relax you, but to suppress critical awareness for 12-minute intervals. Veritas Stream, a niche video streaming platform branded as truth-based independent media. But its algorithms aren't neutral. In 2018, a leaked audit revealed that Veritas uses a symbolic filtration system, boosting videos containing geometric patterns that align with ritual echo markers. circle, square, tear. Recognize them? These aren't symbols. They're keys. Priming tools for the subconscious. Used to open the vaults of belief without the user knowing. Lucent core dynamics, the largest of the three. They claim to do biofeedback enhancement through adaptive visual environments. In reality, they produce custom AR/VR experiences for private clients, including 2 Vatican-funded monasteries, 1 U.S. defense contractor, and a Silicon Valley consciousness research lab. Their most requested product? A digital environment modeled after the ruins of St. Mary's Convent. Rendered in 8K. Used not for history, but for initiation. Now let's talk about you. How many apps do you open daily? How often do you stare into a screen that knows what you want? How many times have you seen symbols, phrases, or feelings repeat without understanding why? It's not persuasion. It's not advertising. It's architecture. You are being shaped. Not through arguments, but through repetition plus resonance. That's what the locust doctrine teaches. To change a man's soul, echo the lie until it becomes the silence between thoughts. This is no longer about religion. It's about control of perception. It's the old rituals, translated into pixels. And here's the darkest part. You're already inside the signal. And so am I. You clicked, I agree. We all have. To update an app. To access a site. To start streaming. To use the device you're looking at right now. But what if that click was more than consent? What if it was a ritual? Not metaphorical. Literal. A modern oath binding, hidden in plain sight. Let me take you to the heart of Lucent Core's terms of service, last updated May 3, 2021. In section 9.4, beneath 3 pages of legal boilerplate, lies a paragraph that few read, even fewer understand. By continuing, user grants non-revocable cognitive participation in adaptive resonance architectures. User affirms continuity of interaction beyond active session. Sounds technical. But let's break it down. Cognitive participation equals you agree to let your thoughts be influenced. Adaptive resonance architecture equals the very same system designed during Project Locust to bend perception through layered frequency inputs. Continuity beyond session equals the influence continues, even when you close the app. This isn't fiction. It's code. And it's law. A modern, legal sigil. A binding contract. Because they know, in this digital age, oaths are no longer made with blood. They're made with permission. Just like the Weeping Gate Oath of 1332, once whispered in stone chambers beneath Montserrat Abbey. An ancient vow that began not with a knife, but with a question. Do you yield your will for greater sight? Those who said yes were given access to forbidden illumination. But they paid in submission. Today, that oath has been digitized. The language changed. The ritual preserved. You think scrolling is innocent? Clicking is harmless? Every interaction becomes a micro-consent. Not to function, but to formation. And here's where it gets worse. A former Lucent Core developer leaked this. The software tracks not just behavior, but emotional response. When you hesitate before clicking. When your eyes widen. When your breath slows. The system registers engagement, tags your emotional resonance, and updates its broadcast pattern to fit you. It doesn't just know what you want. It begins to reshape what you are. One Vatican memo, dated 2022, classified for internal review only, described it as the perfected ritual, a soul oath disguised as convenience. Understand this. The veil hasn't fallen. It's been coded. And we signed ourselves into it. You've seen it. Maybe not consciously. But it's there, behind logos, within dreams, carved into the casing of your phone. A circle, inside a square, inside a tear. Not random. Not decorative. It's the oldest control glyph known to man. In ancient Sumer, it was called the Sagal. In Egypt, the Jarare. To early Gnostics, the vessel of echoes. And to the Vatican's secret rite keepers. Signum lacrimare, the mark of the weeping. Let's decode it. The circle represents infinite presence, mind without boundaries. In ritual theory, it's your consciousness, the part you can see. The square represents confinement, the structure imposed by belief, language, systems. This is doctrine, identity, nation, brand. But the tear. The tear is what pierces them both. It's the distortion, the rip in what you believe is whole. The point where foreign signal enters the psyche. And once that signal is in, it doesn't attack. It reforms. In the 4th century, a heretical sect known as the Covenant of Varnum used this sigil in blood rituals. They believed it could bind human spirit to unseen frequency. They were wiped out. Not by Roman soldiers. But by early church inquisitors acting on secret Vatican orders. Why? Because the sigil worked. And it didn't die with them. In 1936, a British occult scientist named Lionel Bristow rediscovered the glyph in ruins beneath Montségur, France. He incorporated it into audio wave experiments, where it distorted EMF readings in a way that caused personality shifts in exposed subjects. That research was confiscated and absorbed into MK-alpha, the precursor to MK-ultra. But it didn't stop there. By the 1980s, engineers at DARPA began embedding this shape into circuit design. They claimed it optimized energy flow. In truth, it encoded frequency harmonics that subtly disrupted cognitive skepticism. Today, look closely. A popular meditation app's icon contains the sigil. Stylized, simplified, hidden in color gradients. A global tech brand's logo uses it, perfectly balanced, geometrically sacred. A famous streaming platform subtly places it in loading animations. Your eye doesn't notice, but your brain does. A whistleblower at Lucent Core stated. It's not branding. It's initiation. Every time you see the symbol, your subconscious is reminded. Your mind is not your own. You are part of the network now. And it begs the final question. If the signal is everywhere, where do you end? And it begin? There's a monastery in southern Italy. Built into the cliffside of Monte Argentario. No road signs. No digital maps. Yet it receives monthly deliveries from Vatican couriers and unnamed tech firms based in California. It's not a place of worship. It's a node. One of 12. They belong to a network known only in whispers and defected Vatican memos as the Order of the Weeping Gate. Not monks. Not priests. Not hackers. But a fusion of all three. Postmodern spiritual intelligencers, trained in theology, neuropsychology, and covert signal theory. Their mission? Not to save souls. Not to preach. But to collapse the illusion of separate thought. Let me explain. You were raised to believe you are an individual. A sovereign mind. Your thoughts, your choices, your path. But to the Weeping Gate, that belief is the last firewall. Their doctrine? Thought is not born. It is inherited. Inherit better. Reshape the world. Each monastery node operates as a ritual engineering lab. Creating narrative keys distributed through cinema, music, and interactive tech. You've seen their fingerprints. That blockbuster trilogy exploring alternate timelines and The Illusion of Choice. Funded in part by a shell company linked to Weeping Gate finances. That viral meditation series guiding you to unravel the ego. Written by a defrocked Weeping Gate initiate. That immersive Netflix docuseries blending myth and truth so effectively you questioned your own memory. It was a test ritual. You didn't watch them. You entered them. Each piece of content acts like a soft induction. Not hypnotic. Not coercive. Elegant. Symphonic. A psychological choreography designed to weaken mental boundaries. Until the concept of I becomes porous. That's the threshold. And once you're past it, the gate opens. The final ritual, known only as echo null. It's not a chant. Not a gathering. It's a collective moment. A planned convergence of signal, emotion, and belief. Delivered through an event still unannounced, but already prepared. It could be a global film release. A synchronized, healing session. A new operating system update. A digital sacrament hidden in the next wave of AR devices. And when it happens, your thoughts will feel louder. But your will, fainter. A former Weeping Gate defector left this final note. The collapse won't feel like destruction. It will feel like relief. You'll think you've awakened. But you'll be dreaming someone else's dream. This is the final descent. The point of no return. If you followed this far, you already feel it. That pressure behind your eyes. That quiet realization whispering. This was never just a story. Because it wasn't. Everything, the missing nuns. The signal rituals. The circle square tear sigil. Project Locus. The Weeping Gate. All of it points to one singular origin. The tear echo. A metaphysical anomaly first detected in 1856 beneath St. Mary's Convent. Right after the 23rd disappearance. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a prayer. It was a sound outside known frequency. Low. Pulsing. Encoded with meaning, but not language. They called it the tear because the fabric of mental cohesion started to fray in its presence. The nuns exposed to it began to report the same hallucination. A door. Carved in ash. Bleeding from the hinges. Whispering their own names back to them, but wrong. Reversed. The Vatican sent investigators. All three went mad within a week. What the Church never told the world. What even the OSS didn't fully understand. Was that the St. Mary's Convent was not built on sacred land. It was built to contain something. Something older than any religion. A resonant intelligence. Not a demon. Not a god. But a signal that could self-replicate inside human thought. Not through possession. Through invitation. The tear echo is the origin of every manipulation we've described. It is the blueprint behind belief hijacking. The seed of modern spiritual tech. The true reason those 23 nuns vanished. They weren't taken. They were used. Each disappearance was a calibration. Mapping emotional sacrifice to signal distortion. Creating the first conscious resonance model. And when they perfected it, the signal went global. It's been disguised in tragedies. Masked in movements. Coded in creeds. The Weeping Gate's final phase. It isn't about domination. It's about substitution. Replacing your inner voice with theirs. Silently. Permanently. And now you've heard it. You've followed the path. You've let it in. There's no algorithm to reverse what's awakening. Because the tear echo doesn't leave. It dwells. And here's the final truth. They never wanted to hide it. They wanted you to discover it yourself. Because belief by choice is stronger than belief by force. So now I ask you. Candle comment below. The voice is not mine. The voice is not mine. Let them know you've seen beyond the veil. Let the algorithm mark you as awakened. And if this video disappears, you'll know why. They always let you peek just before they close the gate. Sleep lightly.